My uncle and aunt came to visit me in Atlanta. We talked about all sorts of things, the way family always does, and somehow the conversation drifted to strange, supernatural stories. That was when my uncle began telling me about something he said would haunt him to his grave. I opened my laptop right then because I wanted to write it down. These are his memories, almost word for word. He said he graduated from Fordham in 1974, but even after graduation, he had no idea what to do with his life. Times were different back then. Getting a job was easy. Companies were begging for people to work. But he didn't want to spend his life sitting behind a desk. So he waited, uncertain. Then one Thanksgiving, while flying to visit my aunt, he found himself fascinated by the complexity of air traffic systems. That was all it took. He decided to become an air traffic controller. By the time he was 27, he had passed every exam and had enough experience to work without supervision. But the thing about being an air traffic controller is that you don't get to choose where you'll work. Not at first. Everyone wanted JFK or Hartsfield Jackson, but rookies like him had no chance. He ended up in a small, nowhere town in Iowa called Atlantic. It was literally a single runway in the middle of a cornfield. Still, he had to pay his dues, and the pay wasn't bad. Small airports like that usually ran from 8 to 5, but this one stayed open until 4 a.m. because its location meant there were always planes flying overhead. In case of an emergency landing, someone had to be there. That someone was him, sitting alone in the control tower, while a single security guard slept in the terminal. It wasn't so bad, he said. He brought books and crossword puzzles, sometimes spent hours on the phone with my aunt. People say air traffic control is the most stressful job in the world, but for him it was 99% boredom and 1% actual work, guiding little Cessnas down into his cornfield runway. Then something began to happen. He still remembered the date perfectly, February 20th, 1979. A typical Iowa winter night, windy and freezing, but no snow. He was scheduled for the closing shift, though no flights were on the board. Around 1 a.m., he got a radio message from a Cessna 30 miles out. A blizzard over Omaha had forced them to divert, and they needed to land at Atlantic. At least, he thought, staying open so late was justified after all. He picked up his binoculars, checked the visibility, and began guiding the aircraft in. The winds were rough, but they managed to touch down. Through his binoculars, he confirmed the landing, and that was when he saw her for the first time. A woman, if you could call her that, was walking down the runway as if it were a normal street. There were about 100 things wrong with that picture. First, she was wearing a short summer dress, or maybe a nightgown, and she was barefoot. In weather like that, anyone would freeze to death dressed like that. And what was she even doing there? How had she gotten onto an active runway? He radioed the pilot who had just landed, asking if he could see a woman walking toward him. The pilot got out to check. Through the binoculars, my uncle watched him climb down from the plane and walk toward her. At that moment, he admitted, he was almost amused. Nothing ever happened in Atlantic, Iowa, and this was, at least, entertainment. He imagined she'd been in a car accident nearby. The pilot reached her, spoke to her, and she leaned close to his ear as if to whisper something. Then both of them froze. 10 long seconds passed. She stayed leaning close to him, not moving. Then suddenly the pilot turned and sprinted back to the plane. The propeller started spinning. My uncle tried to raise him on the radio, demanding to know what was happening, but there was no response. The plane began taxiing, faster and faster, then lifted off into the night without clearance. He kept calling. No answer. All he could do was make sure no other aircraft were above them. Finally, static broke over the radio. Faint, broken syllables. Run, run, run. He asked him to repeat, but the frequency went dead. The plane was gone. He slumped in his chair, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Run from what? What was he supposed to run from? And then it struck him. The woman. He raised the binoculars again. She was looking straight at him. 200 yards away, in the middle of the night, she was somehow looking directly into his eyes. Her eyes were wide, unnaturally wide. He said it's hard to describe. When someone's startled, their eyes open wide, reflexively, like a defense mechanism. That's how she looked, but without any trace of fear. Just that frozen, unblinking stare. Then she began to run. Not a jog, a full sprint straight toward the tower, never breaking eye contact. He felt a surge of goosebumps crawling over him like a swarm of cold ants. He'd served 6 years in Vietnam, seen things most people couldn't imagine. But this was different. Something about the pilot telling him to run and this barefoot woman charging toward him. None of it felt right. He grabbed the radio, called for Joe, the night security guard. No answer. He looked out the window just in time to see the tower door slam open downstairs. Panic took over. He bolted for the small bathroom and locked the door. Moments later, he heard the control room door upstairs creak open. It wasn't like in movies where you hear slow footsteps and see a shadow under the door. This was chaos. Something running wildly around the room, crashing, slamming, scattering papers. He tried to peek through the keyhole, but only caught glimpses of a dark blur moving unnaturally fast. The noise was so intense, he almost opened the door just to end the suspense. Then something hit the bathroom door hard, nearly knocking him over. Silence followed. He admitted he wasn't brave enough to come out right away. He stayed locked in that bathroom the entire night until the morning shift arrived around 7:45 a.m. When he finally stepped out, he saw destruction everywhere. The control room was wrecked. Radios ripped out, papers and flight charts scattered, radar screens smashed to pieces. When the police came, he gave a full report. It took 11 days to repair everything and get operations back online. The security guard was fired. The police urged them to report anything unusual. They even considered installing cameras, which back then wasn't common. He spent those 11 days trying to convince himself it had all been some deranged woman, maybe a mental patient. That was the only way he could sleep. By March 4th, he was back on duty, still nervous about working nights, but telling himself that whoever she was, she must have moved on. For about a month after that night, nothing happened. The airfield felt normal again, quiet and uneventful. For a while, he managed to convince himself that the whole thing had been some bizarre misunderstanding. But a sense of unease never really left him. And when a major snowstorm was forecast across Iowa one night, he had a bad feeling. He was scheduled for another night shift, and if the snow got too heavy, he might get stranded there. He thought that would be the worst thing that could happen. He was wrong. Around 11 that night, snow was coming down hard. Then a radio call came through. A small private jet about 50 miles out was caught in the storm and needed to land immediately. Normally, a jet like that would be too large for Atlantic's short strip, but this was an emergency. Rules didn't matter when lives were at stake. He cleared them to land, warning the pilot to stay in contact the whole time. The pilot agreed, joking that he just wanted to get the bird on the ground. Outside, the wind howled and snow lashed at the tower windows. Still, the runway was clear. The maintenance crew had de-iced it earlier. He checked through the glass, scanning the strip. That's when he saw her again. She was walking slowly down the runway, barefoot, wearing the same thin summer dress, in the middle of a snowstorm, and she was looking straight at him. That unblinking, fixed stare, the same as before. The wind blew her hair across her face, snowflakes hit her skin, but she didn't blink, not once. It was as if she refused to lose a single second of eye contact with him. He realized then what made her so truly horrifying. Her eyes were alive, but they weren't human. There was nothing behind them, no emotion, no warmth, no life, just the act of looking. The radio crackled again. The pilot was losing altitude. He couldn't maintain level flight in the headwinds and needed to land. My uncle had no choice. He had to let him come down, even though that thing was out there. He gave clearance to land. Then he looked out the window again. She was closer now, maybe 30 feet from the tower. He felt his heartbeat climbing into his throat. He ran downstairs and locked the main door. He knew she was near. He could almost feel her presence through the cold metal. Back upstairs, the radio came alive again. The pilot was on final approach. Through the blizzard, he could see faint lights in the distance, the plane lining up for the strip. But when he looked back toward the runway, she was gone. Relief hit him for just a second. Then he heard it. A loud slam echoed up through the tower. The door downstairs, the one he had just locked, had burst open. He froze. He didn't want to believe it, but he knew. Every nerve in his body screamed danger. Then came the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps clanging on the metal stairs, not running, more like stomping, each one echoing through the tower. He thought about hiding in the bathroom again, but couldn't leave the radio. He had to guide that plane down. The steps grew louder, closer. The control room door creaked open. He said later that he had never felt fear like that in his life, and he wasn't a man easily shaken. He'd been in Vietnam, seen combat, stayed calm through chaos. But this was something else. He couldn't move. He sat there staring at the radio, paralyzed. He couldn't even turn his head to look behind him. His body refused to obey. He pressed the transmitter, barely able to speak. The pilot's voice came through, calm and cheerful. 30 seconds to touchdown. My uncle forced out a reply. All clear. His voice cracked, his teeth chattering from fear. Then he felt it, cold breath on the back of his neck. She was behind him. He could feel the chill radiating from her body, her slow breathing brushing against his skin. He said it was like being frozen in time. The air thick, the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his skull. He could sense her mouth moving closer to his ear, though he still couldn't turn his head. And then she whispered, "Come down to the field. Come down." He said that voice didn't sound like anything from this world. Not male, not female. Cold, distant, filled with a rage that wasn't loud, but seething, ancient, unnatural. It was a whisper, but it was full of hate. There was something missing from it. Something human. At that moment, the pilot's triumphant voice burst through the radio. Touchdown complete. The jet was safe, and with that, the breath on his neck stopped. He heard hurried footsteps racing down the stairs. He forced himself to turn, his muscles aching with dread, and saw nothing. No one in the room. He called the guard again. This time, the man answered and came running. They searched the entire tower from top to bottom. No sign of her, no footprints inside. But outside, in the snow, there were prints leading from the cornfield to the tower door. None leading back. The police came again, but the investigation went nowhere. She had vanished, leaving no trace except those single-direction tracks. He was shaken to the core. He couldn't stop thinking about her, why she appeared to him, what she wanted, why she stared that way. He didn't believe in ghosts, he said, but he didn't believe she was human either. He thought about quitting, but what else could he do? It was his job. And after all, she hadn't hurt him. Not yet. There was only fear, unexplainable and relentless. He told himself spring was coming. The snow would melt, and maybe she'd melt away with it. He tried to believe that. He wanted to believe that. But when spring finally came, the real horror began. After that winter, the city council finally listened to him and agreed to install a security camera. Of course, it was the town of Atlantic, so bureaucracy and budget got in the way. They installed only one camera, and it didn't even record. It could only stream live video to the control room. Still, he accepted it. At least now he could see who was outside the tower door. A month passed, calm and quiet. The fear dulled with time. He started to think maybe he'd imagined everything, or maybe she was just some lost woman who had wandered off. Spring air replaced the cold, and the silence almost felt comforting again. Then came May 3rd. He received a memo that morning. A local politician's plane was scheduled to land around 10 p.m., and he would have to stay late. The moment he read it, the unease returned. It was his first night shift since the last incident, and his instincts whispered that something was waiting. 9:45 came. No sign of the plane. He didn't care. His eyes were glued to the runway, binoculars in hand, scanning every inch of darkness for movement. Nothing. Then, for no reason at all, he glanced down at the camera monitor, and his world flipped upside down. She was standing right in front of the camera, wearing that same white summer dress. Her arms were wrapped around herself, trembling, her whole body shaking. Through the cheap little speakers, he could hear faint sobbing. This wasn't the same presence as before. She wasn't cold and menacing this time. She looked broken. He could hear her voice, soft and choked with tears, pleading, "It's freezing out here. Please help me." He froze, torn between terror and opportunity. If he could get her inside, if someone else could see her, he'd finally have proof. He radioed for Jerry, the night security guard, told him to get to the tower immediately. Then he left the control room. He knew he shouldn't leave an active tower unattended, but adrenaline drowned out reason. He went down the stairs, unlatched the heavy door, and stepped outside into the cold night. She was there, crying softly, hair hanging over her face. His voice shook as he spoke, asking if she was all right, if she needed help. No response, only sobbing. He took a step closer. This was his chance. He could finally catch her, prove he wasn't insane. She lifted her head. Tears streamed down her pale face, glistening in the dim light. For a heartbeat, he thought she was human again. Then her eyes widened, the same way as before. Wide, unblinking, unnatural. He took a step back, telling her to stop, to stay where she was. And then it happened. She repeated his words, the same voice, but with a strange delay. Her lips closed first, and only afterward came the sound, as though it traveled through time itself. The voice wasn't human. It wasn't female or male. It was cold and wrong, stripped of any warmth. She stood inches from him now, faces nearly touching. Her breath was icy against his skin. Her mouth opened wide as if to scream, but no sound came. Then, seconds later, the scream erupted, a shriek so sharp and piercing it froze him completely. It was the sound of something not meant to exist. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. She smiled. It wasn't joy or cruelty. It was simply wrong. Then she lifted one hand and pointed toward the cornfield. Her eyes stretched so wide they no longer looked human. She held that pose for half a minute, or maybe forever. He broke. He shoved her as hard as he could. Unlike the invincible monsters in movies, she fell like a human. Hit the ground hard. A thin line of blood ran from her forehead, but she was still smiling. Then, impossibly fast, she rose to her feet. No one could move like that. He was sure she would kill him. Instead, she turned and bolted, running barefoot into the cornfield. He stayed frozen, mind blank, until the flashing red and blue lights of a patrol car cut through the snow. Relief washed over him. He shouted for the officers, waving frantically. They ran toward him as he held her down, or thought he did. He looked into her eyes one last time. "Why?" he asked her. "Why are you doing this?" She smiled wider, and then, after a short, unnatural delay, he heard her whisper, "See you later, alligator." The officers pulled him off her, and that was when she changed again. The crying started, the fear, the human act. She clutched at her arm, screaming that he had tried to kill her. The police saw a man on top of a bleeding, terrified woman. He tried to explain, but no words came out. The next thing he knew, cold steel cuffs were on his wrists. He kept repeating that she wasn't human. No one listened. He spent the night in jail. There were no witnesses. At least, that's what the police said. Jerry was gone. His only hope was that Jerry would back him up, tell them what had happened. But when his coworkers came to bail him out in the morning, they said Jerry was at the airport right then. He didn't believe it until he saw it himself. He went straight there and found Jerry in the break room, drinking coffee like nothing had happened. He asked him why he hadn't told anyone, why he'd left him there. Jerry just laughed. "What are you talking about, man?" he said. "Nothing happened last night." My uncle stared at him, waiting for some sign of recognition, but there was none. Jerry patted his shoulder and told him to get some rest. That was it, the breaking point. He walked out of that airport and never returned. 3 days later, a formal termination notice arrived in the mail. Not long after that, the police called to say no charges would be filed. The woman had vanished. He moved to New York to live with my aunt. He never saw the woman again, but even now he swears she wasn't human. Not a hallucination, not a ghost. Something else. Something that looked through him, not at him. As he finished the story, my aunt walked into the room, half annoyed. "So he's talking about that woman in Atlantic again, isn't he?" she said. He frowned and said it was worth knowing what's out there. She told him to stop scaring me, that I didn't need to hear his rambling. But he insisted. He said since the day he left, 41 air traffic controllers had quit that same airport. My aunt sighed and said it was getting late, time to leave. I offered to walk them out. Outside by the car, my uncle climbed in while my aunt lingered for a moment. I asked her quietly if it was all true. She smiled tiredly and said no. She explained that around that time, my uncle had been on early depression medication, the kind that wasn't well tested back then, and that was why he'd lost his job. I asked about the woman. She said there had been a girl, yes, but the police had stopped him before he hurt anyone. He'd been fine ever since. I asked one last question. Was it true about the controllers who quit? Her smile changed, from warm to forced. She opened the car door and said softly that they had to get going before nightfall. She told me to call sometime. I had their number, then she said it. "See you later, alligator." The door shut, the car started, and they drove off into the evening. And I stood there in the fading light thinking about those words. "See you later, alligator."